Good morning. Yesterday we had ended the video with essentially discussing in brief about what is the difference between the monotheist religion and polytheist religion, where we had found that yes, monotheist religions are like, today, the modern day, if you have to talk about religions like Islam, Christianity, whereby they have one God, and then a polytheist religion would be the ones with multiple gods, like the classic case would be Hinduism, where we have hundreds and thousands of gods, and everyone is a god for us because we would like to see divinity in every aspect of life. So that is how it is. But then you have to understand that, kind of expanding this a little bit, you have to understand that in the ancient times, when man must have started with, being firstly hunter, gatherer, then pastoralist, agriculturist, farmer. Naturally, he had different affiliations, if I may use the word, different loyalties to different gods. People living in mountains, for example, would be having a mountain god. People who would be living across rivers, the river banks, and who were primarily into farming. For them, the river would be the god or the goddess, for that matter, right? And uh, that is how it went, and that is the reason why, if you look at Rig Veda, the gods who were very, very prominent in Rig Veda were the ones like Indra, who is the god of thunder and lightning and rains. Naturally, so in similar fashion, it was Agni, who was a very important god at that point in time in Rig Veda, and Varun, who was responsible for the winds. He was also a very important god during the Rigvedic times. But as the time evolved and our lives became more complex, and we started living in groups where we gradually started specializing in different professions, and naturally, the gods also started changing. Then suddenly we had Vishnu, and then we had Brahma, then we had Lord Shiva, and that is how it evolved. So it was not only that it was the Romans were into it, or the Greeks were into it, or the Indians were into it, for that matter. Throughout history, if you look at how the concept of religion has evolved, that is how it has been. It started with multiples, and then gradually, our loyalties also changed, and we ultimately, who knows, after probably 500 years, we in India, or if we remain Hindus, that is, we might be having kind of everyone would be praying to, Lord Shani, or some other god. You never know. So that is how it was. It's the same thing with Islam. In fact, in the whole of Arabic world today, everyone is praying Allah. And at that point in time, even in Saudi Arabia, you had multiple gods, and there was an idol worship. There was a whole concept of idol worship, and a very elaborate concept of idol worship. So you have to understand that the gods don't remain same, we don't remain same, and vice versa, for that matter. And that is what it was here, that before Christ and came and completely swept the European subcontinent and North Africa and everything, and the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire, particularly here, they had been praying to different gods, and all of them, again, if you look at the ancient world, I mean, all the gods were, and rather, the forces of nature. Whether it was fire, it was time, it was fertility, it was agriculture, it was river, it was underworld. Everything was about forces of nature, and that is how it is traditionally been. So, coming to today, the next paragraph, the general prosperity was especially marked in the East, where the population was still expanding till the 6th century, despite the impact of plague which affected the Mediterranean in 540s. In the West, by contrast, the empire fragmented politically as Germanic groups from the north, Goths, Vandals, Lombards, etc., took over all the major provinces and established kingdoms that are best described as post-Romans. And students, repeatedly I've mentioned in this chapter while we were going through it that when Roman Empire was at its zenith and it was ruled by very powerful emperors like Julius Caesar and Antony and Caligula, and these were very, very charismatic, very powerful rulers. Then the empire remained united. No one dared attack the empire. But then, as the successors and as the rulers who started occupying the throne were not so strong and not great military generals, and they you would rather like to enjoy life, and naturally the opponents would find the whole ground to be very fertile for them and the right opportunity for them to strike, because the emperor is a weakling. And that is what happened to the Roman Empire as well, where the different tribes who otherwise for years and years had been lying silent and lying low, apart from a few skirmishes, they came out very forcefully because they now knew that the people in Rome were inept, lazy, and they would not be able to handle that onslaught. So these kingdoms overshadowed the beginnings of a different kind of world that is usually called medieval. In the east, where the empire remained united, that is, if you remember, Constantine, who had shifted, who started the Eastern Roman Empire, that is at Constantinople. This is what it implies. In the East, where the empire remained united, the reign of Justinian is a high water mark of prosperity and imperial ambition. So we are talking about Justinian, who was the king of the Eastern Roman Empire, recaptured Africa from the Vandals in 533 AD, but his recovery of Italy from the Ostrogoths left that country devastated and paved the way for a Lombard invasion. So this is, we are talking now a bit of the internal politics and a bit of Italy as a whole, not just the Roman Empire. Yeah, but we are talking particularly about Italy. And by early 7th century, the war between Rome and Iran had flared up again. If you remember, when we had started this chapter, we had mentioned very clearly that at that point in time, these were the two major empires, very powerful empires, extremely rich, very resourceful, and definitely, one thing which was common, the other thing rather was common with them was they did not like each other. And by early 7th century, the war between Rome and Iran flared up again, and the Sasanians, who had ruled Iran since the 3rd century, launched a wholesale invasion of all the major eastern provinces, including Egypt. You have to understand, students, one very important thing, that Sasanians were the last. They were the last rulers, or rather, the non-Muslim rulers of Iran. Okay, you have to understand that before Iran was swept away by Islam, it was ruled by the rulers who had a different faith altogether. They were into the mostly were into they were Zoroastrians, and they were also into the Baha'i faith. So they were not Baha'i faith, though came later, but they were basically Zoroastrians, like you have the Parsis as we call them today, and that's what they were. And Sasanians were the last rulers of that tradition, of that family, where, and after that Islam took over Iran. So when Byzantium, as the Roman Empire was now increasingly known, recovered these provinces in 620s, it was just a few years away, literally from the final blow, which came this time from the southeast. The expansion of Islam from its beginning in Arabia had been the greatest political revolution ever to occur in the history of the ancient world. We shall surely look into this Islamic invasion in the next chapter in greater detail. By 642, barely 10 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, large part of both the Eastern Roman and the Sasanian empires had fallen into the Arabs in a series of stunning confrontations. It was bound to happen, students, because the Eastern Romans and the Iranians, they were so busy baying for the blood of each other and fighting against each other. So naturally, they thought that the Arab uprising and the whole Islam thing would not be any threat to them. They thought, yes, this was just one of the so many tribes who were coming up and probably shouting on their horses' backs, on the horsebacks. So they would be able to control them. They had no idea that they would be swept away forever. So, however, we should bear in mind that those conquests, which eventually extended as far as field as Spain, Sindh, and Central Asia, began in fact with the subjection of the Arab tribes by the emerging Islamic State, first within Arabia and then in the Syrian desert and on the fringes of Iraq. As we will see in Theme 4, the unification of Arabian Peninsula and its numerous tribes was the key factor behind the territorial expansion of Iran. Definitely, we shall see this in greater detail. How it ultimately unfolded. So that is how the Roman Empire ended in a very sorry state of affairs. It just disappeared with a whimper, and such a glorious reign of such great emperors and great contributions that the Romans have made to not just the polity but also art and architecture and astronomy and philosophy, all of that. Definitely, but it just went like every empire goes one day. So the Roman Empire was also gone. Okay, you should be having questions shortly. Thank you. This chapter has come to an end, guys. Go through the maps of this chapter. Every map that is there in this chapter, these are extremely important maps, students. The questions would inevitably be asked, and if you can remember these maps, everything gets very easy for you to understand. Thanks.